From HanselMinutes.com, it's Hansel Minutes, a weekly discussion with web developer and technologist Scott Hanselman. This is Lawrence Ryan announcing show number 392, recorded live Thursday, October 3rd, 2013. This episode of Hansel Minutes is brought to you by Telerik, offering the best in developer tools and support. Online at telerik.com. And by Franklins.net, makers of Gesture Pack, a powerful gesture recording and recognition system for Microsoft Kinect for Windows developers. Details at gesturepak.com. In this episode, Scott talks with Clay McCoy about Groovy on Grails.
Hi, this is Scott Hanselman. This is another episode of Hansel Minutes, and on the phone I've got Clay McCoy from Netflix. Hey, how's it going?
It's great. I'm glad to be here.
I wanted to talk to you because you work on something that is just cool to say, Groovy on Grails, and you work on Groovy projects at Netflix, and you also work on Grails projects. So let's start with, what is Groovy?
So Groovy is a JVM language, a Java virtual machine. It runs on the Java virtual machine. And basically a lot of people there are tired of Java. So you're seeing all these alternative languages popping up like Scala and Clojure and Groovy. And Groovy is probably the gateway language to get off of Java, Java the language, but still stay on the platform and still get to make use of most of the ecosystem. Mm-hmm. And it looks a lot like Ruby. In fact, a whole lot of Groovy developers have seen something like Ruby with an R and seen what you can do there and kind of got jealous. And Groovy's this nice compromise. One reason I say Groovy is a gateway language is because you can basically write Java like you're used to, mm-hmm. and over time get more and more idiomatic. Start leaving off the semicolons, start using closures, which might be a new concept. Get more into the meta programming. So you can really ease into that style of development.
So Groovy, if I'm a Java developer and I sit down and start writing Groovy, it's going to feel really productive because it's basically Java?
Yes, you can write Java just exactly like you would, and the file will have a different suffix. It'll be a .groovy file instead of a .java file.
Interesting. That reminds me of the relationship that the TypeScript guys talk about, where you could take a JavaScript file and just rename the extension and it still works. And then you just start introducing features until the next thing you know, you've moved over to idiomatic languages.
That's exactly right.
Okay. And does it have a console like Ruby has like an interactive Ruby console? Is there an interactive Groovy console?
It absolutely does. Yeah. And so it basically gives you that for a Java programmer, right? Because you can type in what it looks like Java, what is Java, if you want to. It's a good place to start.
Is it a scripting language? But I know it can be used as a scripting language.
So in Java, the language doesn't really lend itself to writing scripts. You have to write all this boilerplate, this main method, and you can start there. Groovy gets rid of all of that boilerplate. So yeah, it's a good scripting language. The one reason you might choose something like Python to write scripts in is because the whole JVM has to start up, right? There's ways around that. There's various ways to keep the JVM running in the background, and your script gets sent to that, and that circumvents those sort of problems. But yeah, but it's not just a scripting language. You can definitely use it for that. It's convenient for that. But you can do anything that you would use Java for. Like we write real applications using Groovy. Really, we find it the most effective way to take advantage of the JVM and the whole Java ecosystem.
Mm-hmm. And right now, if I understand correctly, Groovy is kind of backed by or controlled by VMware, and that's actually because G21 was a company that made Groovy on Grails like in 2007-ish, and they got bought by SpringSource and they got bought by VMware. So there's big money behind this thing.
Sure, but it's also open source,
mm-hmm.
and free to use as a developer, and just a fun way to be productive.
So even though there's a company that backs it, you don't feel like there's any pressure from VMware. They're not trying to do anything with it. It really is a community feel to it.
Oh yeah, it feels and all the way down to the libraries, the things you get to use. The community they're just way maybe more advanced stuff than you'd get in the standard Java community. I don't know.
So you're saying that kind of like, I mean, if I may put words in your mouth, is it like the alpha geeks in Java have said, "Oh, this is cool," and they've kind of migrated over there? So you're getting more advanced thinking in the Groovy space than in the classic Java space?
Maybe. You're definitely getting more Ruby-like thinking. But I wouldn't say there's one set of alpha geeks in the Java community, but I would say that most of the alpha geeks have moved past Java, the language. I don't want to take anything away from Clojure or Scala or a few of the other languages. I love those myself. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Groovy's just another way to go about it.
Why do you think that, what was it about Java that somewhere around 2007, people started getting really excited about building new languages on the runtime, where it went from being Java and Java bytecode to being, right, Scala and Groovy, and all these other people are using Java as a language construction kit?
Oh, it was like what I was saying earlier. You start looking around at these other languages like Ruby that were really becoming prevalent about that time, and I wanted to write Ruby personally, and a lot of people did. But you'd go back and start writing your Java code, and man, it was a bummer. You just didn't have all the cool features there that as a developer you wanted. And Groovy was coming around about that time, and I didn't want to learn Groovy. I wanted to go further away from Java. I wanted to be a Lisp developer. But over time, I realized that I wasn't really going to get paid to do that. And Groovy started looking at this a pretty nice compromise. I was actually going to be able to get it in the door where I worked then and use it, and it was something you could say, look, here's this great thing. Let's try it out. Let's use it for unit testing. And that was a good way to get it in the door, and there was no way I was going to get even Ruby in the door at some of these places that were Java shops that I was working out at the time. But I couldn't get a job as a Ruby developer. I probably could now, but, not then. It wasn't as prevalent. So that's the kind of basis. And then, you invest some time in that, and then you end up being able to go somewhere like Netflix, and they've got, probably because a lot of the same developers with the same background, no Groovy, no Grails, and start writing applications in that. So, at Netflix, a whole lot of our internal applications are Groovy and Grails.
Is there any regular old kind of classic Java at Netflix?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. In fact, most of the main services that make up our real product are just standard Java. Yeah, absolutely.
Now, I heard you kind of say or imply that you were thinking about what your next job would be and optimized your search for the language that you really wanted to work in. Do you think that's common for people to say, like, gosh, I really want to work in foo and bar languages? Who's going to hire me in that language?
I don't know. I guess that's kind of resume-driven development. I mean, you kind of try to find a way to use the things that you like. If you're, everybody's kind of drawn to what they think good software is. It makes them more effective. And when you find those things, you don't really want to let them go. You want to, unless you find something better.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. The language, and you kept saying it's kind of Ruby-ish and Ruby-esque, and of course we're on a podcast, so people can't see us, but when I think of Ruby, I think of compact and expressive and kind of poetic. Ruby people seem to like to build sentences that are clear. So like in a for loop, and I worked in Java, my last experience in Java was like around 2000, maybe 1997, at Nike. Back in when RMI, when remote method invocation first came out, that's how long ago it was that I was doing Java. So when I do a for loop, it's pretty much a classic for loop. A for loop in Java looks a lot like one in C or in C#, but in Groovy, it's a lot terser, isn't it? Oh
yeah. You've got a whole different set of methods on collections, for example, where you're using, instead of for, you've got an each method and you send it a closure. And maybe I should explain closures, like blocks of code that are aren't executed when they're defined, but you just send them around. They're functions that you just send around, and it feels way more productive. It gets rid of lots of boilerplate code.
The concept of closures in general is something that's been kind of like coming up now, where languages want that as a first-class citizen. Like, I should be able to pass a function around as easy as I pass an integer around.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So that's embraced then in Groovy?
Definitely. And you can be very functional in Groovy. You don't have to be. I mean, it lends itself to various styles, but Yeah, it's definitely set up that way, and the enclosures help.
I'm looking at an example where they've taken a for loop with an if clause in between to go and print out, like spin through an array, print out something that's a certain length. And it's 3 methods in Java. If you don't count the curly, it's 3 lines rather if you don't count the curly braces. But in Groovy, it looks a lot like what I would think of as LINQ, where it's just the array dot find all, the clause that is kind of your guard clause, and then dot each, and then print, all in one compact sentence.
Absolutely. It gets rid of tons of boilerplate.
Mm-hmm.
It's very effective.
Now, in the C# and the .NET space, we are kind of cautioned for these things, particularly in LINQ, because they can expand and explode, and you can get yourself into algorithmic complexity in a single line without realizing how complicated stuff is. Do those things exist
Absolutely.
as well?
Oh yeah, so along with especially the metaprogramming, but getting rid of the boilerplate. You can write less code and do more. You're also adding potential to shoot yourself in the foot.
Mm-hmm.
Especially because you can call methods that aren't there at compile time. That come about later or change or drop through to method missing like you'd have in Ruby.
Mm-hmm.
There's all kinds of ways that you can make your code unreadable or not obvious. And so that's why unit testing is probably more important in Groovy than Java.
Mm-hmm. Well, because Java's really static, right? I mean, Java's compiled.
Yes. And Groovy is too, but not up front. It can almost feel interpreted because it may not be compiled until later, especially if you're doing certain dynamic things or using heavy metaprogramming.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So some of the features that Groovy has that aren't in Java is like dynamic typing. You mentioned closures. There's also native syntax for some kinds of arrays and maps and lists and things like that.
Literal maps. Yeah.
What is that?
Literal collections. Well, you don't have to define new array list and add things to it, and it's just a way to get rid of boilerplate code. You just put some brackets and put stuff in the middle, and Groovy knows that's a list, or put some semicolons in there, put colons in there, and you've got key value pairs, and in between the braces, and Groovy just knows that that's a map.
I know that one of your bosses, Diane Marsh, is a big fan of Scala, and I'm going to have her on the show and talk about that. But do you feel that there's maybe one language to rule them all, that like Java people should just give up on Java and use Groovy, or maybe Groovy people should give up on Groovy and use Scala? Or is there really room for multiple languages at Netflix?
I think there's definitely room for multiple languages at Netflix and everywhere. In fact, Scala, I love Scala too. Scala is really interesting in that it's very typed. It's more typed than Java, whereas Groovy, the typing is kind of optional. It feels kind of optional. Mm-hmm. And in our projects, we tend to type more than not, and it's got really good inference. But you can do a whole lot of the same things in both languages. You can be very functional in both. And the enclosure is a third one that's like a Lisp dialect, and that's one that I play with quite a bit in my free time. I mean, that's actually one of the ones that I'd kind of like to work towards doing more at this point. But there's lots of good options,
Mm-hmm. Groovy on Grails. I'm pretty much guessing it's Groovy on Rails previously, but it's literally that. So it would be like a more business-minded web framework, like just as Ruby on Rails put Ruby literally on Rails to make web applications quickly. Is that the exact same parallel?
Yeah, it is. It's a Rails inspired full stack web framework. Mm-hmm. But so you're getting into the whole community that's around Groovy, right? And Grails is probably the most visible one. But before we get into that, there's there's great tools for unit testing that even if you're in the Java space and you want to work in unit testing, unit test your Java code, there's this thing called Spock, which is
like Mr. Spock.
Yeah, that's what but it's awesome. Like spec and mock pushed together, and So when I was first doing this, I would just use regular JUnit, but use it with Groovy, and that helped a lot. But now that Spock is here, it goes so far beyond JUnit. Like, it gives you some structure to build your tests in. It comes out of the box with a mocking framework. And it's really nice. There's GPARS, GPARS. It's a concurrency library. So it's just these nice DSLs on various types of concurrency in Groovy. And there's a project called CodeNarc. And a lot of the syntactic code analysis that you do in Groovy with check style and find bugs and that sort of thing to look at your code and tell you what's wrong doesn't work on Groovy. But CodeNarc does. And
you're saying CodeNarc, N-A-R-C?
That's correct.
Okay.
Yeah. And we use that in our projects to look at the code and look for things that would be possible bugs, or make sure there's consistent code formatting, that sort of stuff. And those are Groovy specific ones. You're still free to pull in Google Guava or standard Java libraries that make the regular Java community great, and use those and get your immutable collections and all that. So there's a lot of great stuff there. But you want to talk about Grails specifically, and that's great, and that's Rails-inspired web framework that's really a bunch of Groovy DSLs on top of a really well-architected Java web application out of the box. Underneath there's proven, mature Java technologies, Hibernate and Spring and that sort of stuff, and you get these Groovy DSLs on top of that.
Okay. So to make sure that we're getting all the three-letter acronyms, you're saying DSLs, right? Domain-specific languages. So these are domain-specific languages that have been written in Groovy that allow you to express very tersely what you're doing. So, for example, like YAML files in Ruby are a special format. So it sounds like Grails is very domain-specific. It's a top-down approach where if you have whether you have a database or not, you need a clean domain model that will map to that database.
That's correct. Yeah.
Okay. And then does it scaffold out or generate views? Is there a view engine?
Yes, there is. You can absolutely do that. But the more mature your application gets, probably the further away you move from scaffolding. But yeah, to get something going really quick, yes, there's definitely scaffolding there.
Okay. And the is the domain objects, how much do they know? Are they kind of like active record in Ruby, where a domain object magically knows how it maps to a database? Or do you have multiple flavors of domain objects, like view models and model converters and all that?
No, the domain objects are pretty much state that know how to persist themselves. You can get various plugins if you're using something that's and the plugin system is actually something we should talk about. If you're using some kind of NoSQL or something, there's a lot of ways to get the domain objects to map to something other than SQL. In Asgard, we actually don't use domain objects or have any kind of database. Mostly what we do is talk to backend services, which is an interesting take on Grails. There's a whole side of it that we're not using, but we still find a whole lot of value in it.
Interesting. So you're not talking to databases and using Hibernate and things like that?
No. Basically, our state is the configuration of objects in Amazon. So that's we kind of think of that as our database and our state, and that's stored by Amazon. Okay.
So then when you talk to a back-end system to ask a question that a Netflix application needs, you're getting back JSON? Or XML, or what is these?
That's probably happening underneath, but now we're getting kind of into Asgard, and it's Amazon has an SDK, and we have a dependency on that, and we make calls to that. So we get back, objects. They look like beans.
Okay. So I want to translate that because I don't know what beans are and things like that. It's been many years. So I want to understand that in a classic Groovy on Grails situation, you will be talking to some underlying database, and the table data comes out and then converts into an object that is, a Groovy object that then you can do something with, and then you map that to a view, and then you look at your HTML.
Right.
But in a Netflix world, which isn't necessarily that world, you're calling some back-end service that's ultimately at Amazon somewhere through, like you said, Asgard, that people can go and look up online and how that works. And that's beyond the scope of what we're talking about.
Okay. Yeah.
But ultimately, you're saying you consume objects, you consume Groovy objects?
No, I was just making, well, yes, but just trying to make the point that Grails is designed for kind of a having a database and a view on top of that, but ultimately this state that's you've got domain objects and state in a database or something similar. But it doesn't have to be. It's a whole lot more flexible than that. And the application, the Grails application that I work on specifically, doesn't have domain objects at all or database.
Okay, so what then paraphrasing, your point is that don't look at Grails and just say, oh, well, look, it doesn't fit exactly with my domain objects, therefore I can't use it. Because it's working fine and you don't use it in the classic or expected way.
Right. In fact, Grails can be really flexible, and it's got a plugin system with you can write your own plugins. But there's tons of them out there, hundreds and hundreds. And you can use plugins to add, like I was saying, NoSQL backends to your domain objects, caching, security, search tagging, even things like Twitter Bootstrap or Angular or something. You want to bring that in. Sometimes you open up the plugins and see what they're doing and kind of do something similar. Like if I'm bringing Angular into my Grails app, I might not use the specific plugin for that because I don't want to wait on somebody to update the library when I want a new version of Angular or Bootstrap. I want it then as soon as it came out, things like that. So sometimes there's reasons to circumvent the plugins, but they can be very helpful and save a lot of time.
So you can make views, it's model view controller, which a lot of people who listen to this show are familiar with, and you can use web controllers. You can make then Groovy server pages, or I presumably plug in other views if you prefer, other view model.
Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
Yes.
What about like web services? Can Groovy produce JSON and be a RESTful endpoint?
Yes. We do a lot of that in Asgard, the Grails application I work on, because people don't just use it from a user interface. More and more people are scripting against our application, want that JSON. Yeah.
And is that pretty straightforward? Like, are those things hidden when the domain model object or a list of objects turns into JSON? Is that just a serialization effort? It's not a big deal?
Basically, you have to do a little bit in your code and to render JSON or XML output rather than going straight to the page. But you can basically take the same output and wrap it up in a little bit of code that sends it and with that specific type of output. That's actually gotten really easier, a whole lot easier in the newest version of Grails 2.3. They put in some really good REST support. So
it really is actively being developed. Like people notice, like, oh, this is a problem, and then it gets fixed.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Okay, that's cool. The what was I going to ask you? The view engines are pluggable while they come with a standard one, but what about the move towards single page applications? Like I'm hearing people who like to make declarative statements saying MVC is dead as a model and everything is going to be, model view controller on the client and these Gmail type Angular apps where there's really effectively nothing on the back end but services. How has that kind of movement changed how you use your framework and as well as Grails?
Well, that's one of the directions that we're wanting to go with Asgard. Specifically, you've basically got kind of two different MVC layers that overlap a little bit.
Right.
But the Grails application, you start to not use the GSPs. That's the view layer. They're like JSPs, which is popular in Java, right? But it's Groovy, and it looks like it's basically a template with some Groovy code in it. But what you end up with is a Grails backend that is really just there to make public RESTful services, right? And if that goes to a page that's actually an Angular template, and it's filling in its state from the RESTful service, Ajax calls to this Grails RESTful service.
Right.
There's nothing wrong with that. That's fine. And Grails still offers a whole lot to help you there. A build system that can even manage your static resources like your HTML templates, CSS, and JavaScript and that sort of thing, and be your RESTful services. service endpoints.
That's cool. So you actually answered exactly what I wanted to hear, which is that that when you buy into an environment like this, you're buying into their MVC pattern, but you're also getting their build system and their serialization style and their view models and their view engine and all these things. And even in a world where we are moving towards a lot of JavaScript on the front end and not a lot going on the back end, there's still value in a framework like this.
Sure.
And does it prescribe one way or the other? Are there talks about, like, in Rails, they're very opinionated. And every version, there'll be some big opinionated declaration like, this is the version where we go to CoffeeScript, and this is the version where we introduce a media pipeline.
Yeah.
What's the sense of opinionatedness in the Grails community?
Not like that. I mean, there's a default that's picked. Like the standard database used to be, I forgot what it used to be, and they changed it to H2. They changed out their default. The testing framework used to be JUnit. Now it's Spock, which I was talking about earlier, as default.
Right.
So they provide defaults, but then very, very often you're going to have plugins will pop up that let you plug in whatever you want for that, or you can do it yourself. It's not opinionated to the point where you can't do your own thing.
Okay.
Mainly, somebody's got to pick a default, right, to make it work out of the box.
Right. I guess it's whether or not they pick a default or whether they impose the default upon you is where. No
imposing. No, it doesn't feel like it's imposed.
Okay, well, that's good to know.
Yeah.
I think as someone who works on the ASP.NET side on MVC, there's a lot of kind of pressure from some parts of the community to say, make a decision and make a default. And then other people say, well, make it as pluggable as possible so I can change and swap out anything. And it's tough.
Sure.
It's tough to find that happy medium.
Oh, yeah. But the plugin the community and the plugin ecosystem really help that.
Yeah, definitely. And is this something that you think is expanding inside of Netflix? More and more people are moving to Grails because they're seeing other teams doing well?
It's popular. Yeah. You have a few applications, internal applications that are popular and people use every day.
Mm-hmm.
And when it's time to do another one, people tend to take what was successful and keep on going with that. People see that, Grails is fun and easy to develop in, and several more Grails applications pop up. We've got another one called ICE that is a Netflix open source Grails application that tells you how much money you're spending in the cloud, basically.
ICE, ICE?
Yes.
Interesting. And then when someone at Netflix starts a project, do they just decide to pick a language, or do you have to ask permission to do Grails?
No, you don't ask any kind of permission at Netflix, really. They're big on saying freedom and responsibility.
Mm-hmm.
So you got the freedom to do whatever you want, but you're responsible for making it work.
So ultimately, your decision it's not one. There's prescribed languages you have to pick, but as long as you pick one of those, like you couldn't bring in something completely out of left field, could you?
You could absolutely, yeah.
But then you'd have to maintain it, I assume.
Yeah, you're putting a burden in place if you were to make this really unique thing and then leave, and they have to find somebody else with a skill set to to pick up from there.
Mm-hmm.
But that's you've got the freedom to do that if it's something you think is the right thing to do. It's a great culture to be a part of.
The Netflix culture?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. It's just wonderful to get that sort of freedom and be trusted to that extent.
I like to tell a story about a Netflix person, and I forget his name. I could go and search for it, but he's like the chief architect. He's a British guy. He's got like a PhD and like white hair. Do you know who I'm talking about?
No,
like
not
chief
a fan.
cloud. Let me look this up. He's like the chief cloud architect, and he was at a conference, and he was talking about.
Adrian?
Adrian Cockcroft.
Yes. Oh, yeah.
Okay. So he was at this conference, and he was talking about, using Cassandra, and he was talking about moving Netflix to Europe and, how the relationship with Amazon works. And he was talking about how many more IOPS, how many more, operations per second he was getting using SSDs over spinning Rust, and how he really preferred those.
Yep.
And he was saying, well, it's 3 times more expensive. It's 10 times faster. This is a no-brainer. And he's very wise, and he's got chief in his title, and he's English, so everyone respects him immediately. And then a young person in the audience started kind of stood up and asking a bunch of questions and lecturing him about how SSDs fail. And the guy goes on and on and on, and Adrian is letting him talk. And then he says, "What do you think about that?" And Adrian says, "I don't care. I'm renting them. That's Amazon's problem." And it was fantastic. Like, he should have just dropped the mic and just, or even thrown the mic at the kid, because it was kind of galling for the kid to kind of call him out like that. But at the same time, he handled it with such aplomb. But it completely changed my perspective on the level at which one operates at cloud computing.
Oh yeah, it's totally different. So people, I work on a Grails application that manages, or people use to self-service and manage their deployments and their Amazon objects, right? Mm-hmm. And sometimes people get almost offended of that you're just wiping out servers and creating new ones, and how wasteful. But it's a different mindset. Some people are used to treating their servers like they're puppies. Mm-hmm. And in the cloud, you treat your servers like they're cattle.
Wow. That's deep.
Yeah, well, I didn't come up with that, but it's very true.
Do you know who came up with that so we can credit them appropriately?
No, but I can look it up.
That's great. Yeah, you're absolutely right. And cloud computing changes your speed at which you work. It changes your financial model. It changes what you choose and how you choose to deploy, how you treat this. It is cattle. I like that.
Yeah.
Well, thanks so much for chatting with me today, Clay McCoy from Netflix.
Absolutely. Thank you.
This has been another episode of Hansel Minutes, and we'll see you again next week.